following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
And the very last thing I'll say on this topic is that I'm also like a really big believer in people being able to do what they love. And I truly believe that you'll be able to create more value if you're able to follow your passions. So I think Web3 is also a clear enabler of that.
GRTiQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Craig Tutterow and Ricky Esclapon, both of whom are data scientists at Edge and Node, a core dev team working at the graph. If you've seen some of the recent analytics and data about activity in the graph, then you've seen Craig and Ricky's work. Both Craig and Ricky offer an incredible view into the topic of data, both in the graph and in Web3. And they also share important ideas about how Web3 is changing the data landscape, why it's important, and how the graph is leading the way. And, as you'll hear, Craig and Ricky both have divergent backgrounds and entry points into Web3, showing, once again, the type of talent and intellect Web3 is attracting. As always, I started the discussion by asking Craig and Ricky about their background, starting with Craig.
Yeah, so I did a PhD at University of Chicago Booth. So it was the same program that Hiroki was in, who was on a few weeks ago, except I was more on the macro organizational behavior side. So my affiliation was more with the sociology department. I did a lot of work on network science. So looking at, in particular, the structure of mediated markets and how those shape competitive dynamics and producer outcomes in specific industries. After that, I went on to Google to do a postdoc in their people analytics group. So I was doing network science and data science projects there. Following that, I went on to LinkedIn, where I worked in the network growth data science group. And there I was focused on the automation of measuring network effects. So sort of augmenting what we do in A/B testing and looking not only at the impact of a feature on the person who sees the feature, but indirect impacts downstream in terms of how their behavior affects other people's behavior on the site. During that, I got really interested in software engineering, and that was the part of the job that I was enjoying the most. So I went on to join a group internally called DSPX, Data Science Productivity X, and we were working to build tools that created multi-factor improvements in data science productivity. So we were trying to automate some of the repetitive analyses and models that people were producing, also give people the ability to contribute to internal corporate web applications without having to know everything about DevOps or web development. They could just use Python and SQL, the things that they knew, and contribute new visualizations or models or analytical output and plug that into different corporate web applications that we had internally.
And how about you, Ricky? What can you tell me about your background?
Yeah, so I got an undergrad in information management, which was basically business analytics work. And my sophomore year, I took a course in business analytics, which really drew me towards the working with data type field. I really fell in love with working with data through that course. Had an unbelievably great professor that I still collaborate with to this day. So that was a really great experience for me. And I just kind of started doing all sorts of data-related tasks. And I basically got an internship working for a pretty big company. And I was doing kind of a lot of like manual data collection type work. So I started diving more into work around like web scraping and like data collection, data cleanup. And I was also really interested in crypto. So I kind of tied that into like my personal work. And I started kind of going down this path of trying to create like models to like predict cryptocurrency prices, which eventually turned into me creating kind of this open source tool to or not really open source tool, more like a publicly accessible website where people could kind of learn data science kind of for free through the website on live data sets, which I thought was kind of a pretty cool approach. But yeah, during my day job, I worked a lot on like data preparation, reporting, automation tasks. A lot of what I did actually that led me to the graph really had to do with like my own personal projects.
Well, Ricky and Craig, part of the reason we're talking today is you're both working on data and analytics at Edge and Node. And of course, as listeners know, the graph really powers much of the data and analytics currently of Web3 and hopefully well into the future. What I love about both of you is the different entry points you had into Web3 and into crypto and the graph. Starting with you, Ricky, you took more of a community crypto-based interest. What can you tell us about how you first became interested in crypto and why you decided to pursue a career in it?
So the very beginning of my journey in crypto, I would say, is I bought some Bitcoin back in 2014. But kind of skipping ahead, I think I really got captured by everything that happened around the Ethereum ecosystem around 2017, which is pretty common among guests of the podcast, it sounds like. So yeah, the idea of autonomous organizations was really fascinating to me because I felt like Web3 could solve a lot of things I didn't really like around traditional business. So I guess at the very beginning, it was definitely from an investment perspective, and I would be lying if I didn't admit to that. But the main thing that made me really passionate about the field is the potential it has for fixing things that, again, I don't really like about traditional business. So I think one big piece of that for me is the incentives that an organization has. So to me, building a business is about bringing a lot of value to society. And traditional business has this notion that the very best way of doing that is by only focusing on shareholder benefit. So basically only focusing on making the investors as much money as possible. But I actually really disagree with that. And I think today we have a ton of evidence that shows us those theories aren't always valid. So the way I see it, basically every company doing anything good for society is only doing it out of, what we call inline self-interest, which essentially means you're only benefiting the community because you believe the positive reputation that comes with those actions will provide a larger amount of profit to the investors than not taking those actions in the long run. So this idea is usually seen as like a really positive thing in business. But if the only objective is to create wealth for the investors, this idea really easily breaks down when a corporation grows large enough. And the legally correct thing to do becomes to extract as much value from customers and the communities a business should actually be helping. So I think one clear-cut example of that is this idea of planned obsolescence, which is something that I've been really interested in. So basically, a company is a lot better off if it can keep selling customers the same product multiple times rather than just the one time. So let's say you're selling a light bulb. You don't want to create a light bulb that lasts forever because it won't be as profitable as having those customers come back to eventually buy a new light bulb. So we see this all the time in products like iPhones, cars, video games, and the list really goes on and on. Companies just want to sell you something new every year because it's just more profitable to do that. So I think this concept is particularly damaging when it comes to software and data. So like the way I see it is we could build really amazing things if we treat the different components as building blocks that you can just keep building upon. But if we're controlled by a traditional company, there's always going to be the incentive and almost even responsibility, I would say, to capitalize on the large user base. So yeah, there's always going to be an incentive and even responsibility, almost, I would say, to capitalize on having a large user base. And the fact that it is a foundational tool that enables really cool applications to work and leverage the fact that there would be a high cost for those developers to rebuild things on a new platform. So we see this all the time in big tech companies, for example, where companies like Facebook, YouTube, and a lot of these giants start by providing great services, even at a loss, to capture these really large user bases. And once you have a large user base, it's really easy to become profitable because users are already invested in your platform. So you can basically keep finding ways to profit from them as long as their switching costs basically outweigh the damage you're doing to them. So I think these ideas that I was, these kind of patterns I was seeing in traditional business is what really kind of initially attracted me to the idea of like decentralized organizations and kind of how this model could be a lot better. And just to quickly touch on another point, I think the other big piece for me here is that I think there's a lot of potential around creating, more equitable systems that function more like true meritocracies. And I think, why wouldn't you want something like that? And I don't think Web3 solves every problem in this aspect, but I do see it as a step forward from these traditional business models. And the very last thing I'll say on this topic is that I'm also like a really big believer in people being able to do what they love. And I truly believe that you'll be able to create more value if you're able to follow your passions. So I think Web3 is also a clear enabler of that.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, gaps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ. Thank you for listening to this podcast and for supporting this project, especially those of you who have taken the time to leave a review, rate the podcast, or share an episode on social media. The GRTiQ podcast shines a light on the people working to build the graph, and each week we get to meet a new member of the graph community to hear their story, to get a fresh perspective, and hopefully to learn something new. If you have the ambition to help build the graph, then take initiative and get involved. Join the Graph's Discord, start reading and contributing to posts in the Graph's forum, join the Graph's Telegram and Reddit channels, and look for ways to make a contribution. They're out there. If I can do it, so can you.
Thank you for your support.
Well, I love that answer, Ricky, and thank you for sharing that. A lot of philosophical points that I think listeners will understand and appreciate. I want to turn to you, Craig, now, because in contrast to a lot of what Ricky shared there, you worked for the big companies. You mentioned Google, you mentioned LinkedIn, you've got a PhD. How did you then find your way into Web3 and crypto?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say, I was kind of living in a parallel Web 2 timeline. So my perspective might be kind of interesting for the OGs that have been around a while and sort of saw the value from the beginning. So I had been kind of a crypto skeptic for a while. I mean, I had been following, from the sidelines for a while. So I got into Bitcoin in 2013, and it was interesting conceptually, but then I didn't see a broader use case for it. I kind of went away for 2 years, and just focused on other things. And then in 2015, there was an ICO for Augur, and Augur is a prediction market built on Ethereum. And I was just interested in prediction markets because that was just an academic interest. It's a good way to aggregate collective intelligence. And if you're buying insurance, it's good to know what the likelihood of, someone winning an election or something like that is. But those would always get shut down, when they were on Web 2 rails. And so I thought, it'd be interesting to have censorship resistant prediction market. So I didn't really know much about Ethereum at the time. I thought it was like a crowdfund sort of deal. So anyway, I just pitched in a little bit, just went away for about 2 years, didn't follow anything. And then 2017 ICO boom happened. So I came back and looked at the product and tried to use it, and it was just completely unusable. It's just like a spinning wheel the whole time. It'd take minutes to load. I don't know if they were using like an archive node as their database or like what they were doing exactly, but it just did not work. And so you could see all this hype, but on the ground, like the products were not usable, and they were clearly not ready to scale to anything like what people were talking about at the time. So that's, some skepticism set in there. Because I didn't really see a path to scaling or like mainstream usage. But what I think the interesting thing is that's like the parallel kind of Web 2 timeline and crypto skeptic timeline. But, people at the same time, the people at the Graph, the founders were looking at that exact same problem, and they were thinking about it in a different way. It wasn't like, this is, this can't scale as it is right now. It's like, okay, that's a problem. We need to solve that before we scale. So basically they figured out a way to scale OLTP queries to be on par with what you would expect in a consumer web app by indexing blockchain data. And so that to me was pretty amazing. So, when I came back to it and made my first Uniswap transaction, the light bulb went off and I started going down the rabbit hole, and I figured, I have to figure out how is this stuff scaling now, whereas like before it was completely unusable. And so that's kind of how I learned about the graph. And it's kind of bridging, the Web3 architectures and the Web2 architectures and, making hybridization work there. So that was very interesting. I was very impressed with the team, and just very excited to be able to work here and contribute to that, because like, what more could you want to do? How could you have a bigger impact on the world right now than working on this technology and enabling, what Ricky was talking about with respect to broader user ownership of platforms and technology and data?
Well, I want to talk a lot more about the graph and Web3 and especially data and analytics. Before we do, I think it'd be helpful for guests to understand what it is you do at EduNode and what you're working on. Let's start with you, Craig.
Yeah, so far our work has mainly been setting up internal systems for monitoring and improving the network performance. So we want to get the decentralized network, the quality of service up to like really high standard availability and performance so that people can self-serve. We also want to monitor growth of developers and make sure they're having a good developer experience and so forth. So really coming up with like these KPIs, putting into place data pipelines to monitor those and dashboard those over time and make those available within the core developer community. But we haven't even started to scratch the surface of what's possible with Web3 data science and in terms of like the graph enabling the rest of the ecosystem. So that's something I really hope to get into more.
I guess the only thing I would say, is kind of echoing what Craig said. We're creating a lot of kind of useful data-driven reports of sorts, which is something that I really enjoy doing and contributing to.
So the work you're doing at the graph is obviously very important, and it's nice because there's a lot of charts, a lot of KPIs, a lot of data. And like you said, Craig, there's a lot more to come. So it's a very interesting time in the roles that you have. I want to go back to something you said earlier, Ricky, which was a lot of these philosophical reasons why you moved into crypto and into Web3. And I'd be curious why your role at the graph, or why the graph protocol itself, addresses some of the concerns or interests that you had initially.
So the main thing I would say there is, again, as I mentioned, I'm creating a lot of these kind of data-driven tutorials that like use live data. And I was really fascinated by the idea of like being able to create this, permanent applications and permanent content. And I think the graph absolutely addresses these concerns. And it's huge because I was actually, as I was building my project, I was running into a lot of issues around APIs that I was using, both becoming deprecated over time, as well as then having all sorts of like rules and regulations around them. And being able to use the graph was actually a huge unlock for my project, because I was actually starting to wonder, like, how am I going to be able to develop the projects that I have in mind? And I was starting to think like, wow, like I kind of need something that works, exactly like the graph does today. And I was honestly amazed that the team had thought of this as a problem, 3-4 years ago at this point. So that was amazing to me. So I was very impressed by the graph when I first came across it, and really enabled my projects to kind of go in the direction that I ultimately want them to go.
Yeah, so I was interested in developer productivity. And when I was looking at crypto and what's happening here, the developer velocity is just, it's insane. Like the speed at which like people are innovating and creating new things, and the extent to which things change week to week. And the other amazing thing is like we were able to scale to this level with, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people building over a winter when everyone was kind of very skeptical that this would ever work. And, now we're scaling to like millions of users and seeing this sort of like influx of developers and development activity. And the only way I can make sense of that is like, there is something to the technology, to having a world readable, world writable, append only database that everyone has access to, with standards around open source code. Yeah, I feel like it's a productivity multiplier in ways that we haven't really seen in a long time. And we're also seeing a lot of experimentation around organization, how people are coordinating with each other in DAOs. And one of the problems, like macroeconomic problems, has been the great stagnation. So like, even though we've had all this innovation in terms of like digital tooling, digital transformation. We haven't seen that show up in the productivity statistics. And kind of one of my theories around that is that, while the tools might be better, the way we organize ourselves is the exact same as it was 100, 150 years ago. There hasn't been a lot of innovation in terms of corporate governance and organization. And so we're starting to see that now. And that is very exciting. And I feel like that will lead to some improvements in terms of productivity. So I think there is some sort of unlock that's happening here. And the graph is enabling that by making the data usable and queryable, because otherwise it would be very difficult to access in an efficient way where you could use it in applications.
Yeah, and if I may just add, one thing that really also attracts me with the graph is just the underlying fact that it uses GraphQL, because to what Craig said around like all the great points that he just made, I think, traditional APIs really only enable you to create data analysis and, kind of things around data that originate from how the API was designed. So like you design an API with specific usage already in mind. Versus GraphQL is much more powerful because it allows any user to kind of use the infrastructure to create any kind of analysis and any kind of tooling or whatever around that endpoint versus a traditional API, which again only allows you to do what the developer originally had in mind. So I think that also really attracted me to the graph.
We're talking a lot about revolutions that are happening right now. We're talking about an evolution in the internet. We're talking about a change in corporate governance and structure, modification of business models. When it comes to data and analytics, how would you explain that revolution that's occurring and how the graph fits into all of that?
Yeah, the big difference in Web3 is obviously that the data is public. So instead of having this kind of false choice between like privacy and transparency, we can have both. So by enabling pseudonymous transactions, you can have radical transparency in terms of like the activity on the ledger and have that be publicly visible to everyone. And what that means is that the data isn't locked into these silos. And so that creates a lot of really interesting opportunities and competition because you don't have as much lock-in because the data is available to any developer to kind of piggyback on. So siloing data is like the source of a lot of issues. If you think about like, in finance, like being able to measure counterparty risk, that's very difficult when data is siloed. If you think about moving from one social network to another, bootstrapping a social network, that's very difficult when data is locked in and siloed. So it gives users a lot more choice. It creates a lot more competition and a more vibrant marketplace for software development, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Craig said. And it really is about accessibility because, all of us, in our daily lives, we use quote unquote data to make decisions. Like every decision we make, any action we take is always driven by data, even though it doesn't come in the traditional sense that we're talking about right now, of pulling data out of an API. As people, we do kind of formulate decisions around having information available to us. So I think making, the data we're talking about right now kind of more accessible to like the general public and, anyone in a much more accessible fashion is going to just enable so many kind of positive consequences from there.
When we say data, I think when we're talking about it here during this podcast, there's probably two senses of the term. In one sense, it's data related to the graph, amount of users, amount of queries, and the types of reports you can run there. And then there's this other sense of data, which is blockchain data and smart contract data and all the things happening on the chain. How would you orient listeners towards the types of things you're working on in the two senses in which we're talking about data?
Yeah, I don't think we've even scratched the surface of what we're going to be able to do with the graphs data. And the Google analogy, looking from the outside, I was like, is that really accurate? Just being an API SaaS is like, for blockchain data is big enough. Like, that's great. I wasn't sure how much of a stretch that would be. But after learning more about the systems and being on the core development team for a little while, I think it's definitely not a stretch at all. It's just we haven't gotten to that use case yet because we're trying to make that base use case of the API, serving real-time data for applications. We're trying to get that use case very solid first. But in terms of the next few years, like that is definitely a possibility where we see people doing more machine learning, data mining, offline type data science analysis on blockchain data using all the aggregated subgraphs. So a subgraph is basically a lot of index blockchain data stored in a Postgres database. And we have, indexers combined have hundreds of terabytes of blockchain data. And this is it's going to be like very useful in terms of like coming up with new types of applications. So if you think about like a Web3 social network or a token recommendation engine or a search engine, those are things that, we don't have any proof of concept for yet. But that data is all there in the Postgres databases to do things like that. So that is definitely something we want. Like it's on our long-term roadmap to like basically enable people to be able to run these type of models and to decentralize every part of the data science stack so that we have, the graph is not only serving these online API use cases, but also like what Databricks or Snowflake does for data warehousing in Web 2, having the graph be able to enable those types of use cases as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Craig just said. And I would almost even go another step forward and like thinking about like how incredible would all the things that Craig just said when you apply them to all public data. I think that could have a huge positive impact because it does make the most sense in the context of blockchain data to do something like this because blockchain data has verifiable cryptographic proofs that essentially allows you to get to an objective truth about something. But even going further than the 3 to 5 year timeline, if you were able to do something like this on kind of all public data, then and do all the things that Craig just mentioned, that would have such a huge positive impact.
It seems to me Web3 is fundamentally data-based. I mean, it just seems like the whole foundation, to use what you just said there, Ricky, is proofs and data and transactions. And so I'm wondering, with this ocean of data that seems to be created probably every second, how important a solution like the graph is for Web3 to really deliver on its promise in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's critical. Like I was saying with the Augur use case, there's all of the applications now are hybrid architectures. So a lot is still running on like partially on Web 2 rails. And the reason for that is just because there's a limited amount of block space. Not everything is going to happen on blockchains. Okay, but the most valuable transactions and interactions will, and more will be happening on blockchains. And so the graph is, critical for all of those and bridging Web 2 infrastructure and Web 3 infrastructure. So we have to enable some sort of hybridization in an intelligent way that preserves the benefits, the decentralization benefits of blockchains, but also enables the performance and all the things that have been built up to scale, to a worldwide user base.
Yeah, I completely agree. Without something like the graph, as Craig just mentioned, you do fall back into having to rely on, Web 2 type tools, because unfortunately, it's not very simple at all to actually extract the data out of the blockchains. Like you literally need to, download the entire blockchain and then parse out the data and then figure out how to actually put it in a more usable format. And you should also consider like how difficult would it be if you have to do this for every single blockchain? We always talk about a multi-blockchain future. So having to kind of do a different process, for each blockchain and application you're interacting with is really not ideal. So having something like the graph, which like unifies all these things and maintains those Web3 ideals, like Craig just mentioned, is incredibly vital.
Hi, this is Ricky Esclapon, and I'm a data scientist at EdgeNode working on the graph. If our conversation with the GRTiQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
GRTiQ podcast.
Thank you for listening.
Well, I really looked forward to the opportunity of speaking with both of you because I know you're working on data at the graph and you get to see and observe things that a lot of us don't get to. So I'd just be curious to open it up a little bit and get a sense of some of the things you've seen or observed that have surprised you or interested you.
Yeah, so without getting into anything super specific here, I do think that it actually has been surprising to me, just the speed and scale at which the graph as a protocol is actually ramped up to something functional. Because I think, there's a difference between the theory of something working the way you would expect it to, and then something actually working that way. And I think, in theory, it's amazing to think about how the graph could actually be more reliable than traditional databases and faster and all these kind of amazing attributes around it, and actually be able to see those kind of improve over time and already getting to like very, very good levels of like quality of service for the users has been really incredible to see.
Yeah, it is amazing to see the amount of throughput and the amount of data that's being generated, and also the quality of data just coming in terms of queries. The graph has a very unique position in that it's a gateway to a lot of different Web3 sectors. So whether it's gaming, metaverse, DeFi, DAOs, they all have subgraphs. And so, yeah, the scale has been amazing. But yeah, we want to, open source more of that data and get it out there so that people in the community can use it to power their decisions. So like whether it's like quality of service on specific subgraphs, so people are getting real-time updates on that, subgraph developers are able to see that real time, or indexers knowing, how the indexer selection algorithm works and, where they're ranking within that. Those are definitely things we want to be able to push out insights to network participants in real time. And then also stuff like, business intelligence, like what percent of Web3 users are mobile, in different sectors, or like, what's the geo split? And Ricky has mentioned, like doing some deep dives on geo split across chains and things like that. So this sort of usage data, I think, is going to be really interesting. And that's also something we're looking to open up and, work with the community on publishing some of those insights. So, yeah, those are the things that have struck me.
Can you give us a specific example, Craig, of an insight or something you're working on to that point?
Yeah, so I can give one, since we've been focused internally, I can give an example on the decentralized network, some of the deep dives we've been doing. So I think most people in DevOps and most site reliability engineers would kind of understand intuitively that outages or like, failed queries are a bursty thing. It's like you can have an outage, like usually things will be performing great, 4 nines, et cetera. And then there will be an outage and it'll dip quite a bit, but very briefly, and then you recover from the outage and so forth. So performance can be very bursty. And what we noticed in the indexer selection algorithm is that, it was routing queries to the indexers that were performing the best, of course. But sometimes those high performing indexers would get overloaded or have an outage, and the algorithm wasn't responding quickly enough to those outages. So it was like their score was decaying kind of slowly. And we found that, if it responded more quickly to an outage and treated those qualitatively different than something where their performance was just like decaying linearly, that we could improve quality service on the network quite a bit. We could reduce the number of errors like 30, 40%. So that's one example of, a deep dive that we've done where we identified something that could improve network performance, and we're doing more of those.
Ricky, when people get involved with the graph, they've got a lot of things to learn. They have to reorient themselves to what an indexer is, how token economics work, and a whole host of other things about the Web3 and crypto space in general. When it comes to data, how do people need to approach or reorient themselves to that in a Web3 type environment?
I actually think that's one of the beauties of the graph is, yes, there is a lot to learn in terms of the roles. But I would also say that if you really dive deep into it, it's really necessary. There's no kind of added, tokenomics just to have tokenomics. I think everything that the graph has done from the roles perspective is really necessary. And once you familiarize yourself with those aspects, I think as a user who's interfacing with this data, there's really no difference in the GraphQL endpoint that you're using, whether it's, a traditional GraphQL endpoint or one that comes from the graph. So I think the team's done an excellent job in that sense. So I've been really happy with that, in that transition of like just a regular user to coming into being more deeply involved with the graph. I think those experiences are actually quite similar. It's just the nature of the data is a bit different, obviously, but as a user experience, I would say it's actually quite similar, which I think is definitely the approach to go with.
Craig, given what Ricky just explained, I'd be curious, given your background at LinkedIn and at Google, obviously 2 organizations with a lot of data, and I would assume a lot of viewpoints about the future of data, what is it that maybe they need to better appreciate or understand? Or maybe speaking to yourself 7 years ago, what you wish you would have better understood about blockchain and the future of data?
Yeah, my recommendation would be to not think about blockchain or Web3 as an all or nothing thing where, either everything is going to be on the blockchain and run on blockchains versus like we have to have entirely centralized siloed databases within these large monopolies. So it is possible to have, an intelligently constructed hybrid architecture where some things are stored on the blockchain and other things are happening more in derived databases like what we do in the graph. So I think that people in Web 2 would probably be skeptical that, Web 3 or blockchain systems can scale to accommodate the type of user base that they work with, which is billions of people. And I think that's a valid concern, but that has been massively de-risked, I think, partially due to the graph. And yeah, so I think there's a very optimistic story to tell in terms of scaling with some sort of hybrid architecture. And I do think, many people are very sympathetic to the ideas of Web3. I don't think most software engineers in Web 2 got into it really wanting to monopolize data collection or, anything like that. So I think people are very sympathetic to the ideals, and you see that with a lot of founders like kind of pivoting their companies to, more of a Web3 ethos. It's kind of like, they're questioning how things have played out in Web 2 and thinking about how we can fix some of these things. So I think there is a lot of sympathy there within Web 2. And so, yeah, it's just a matter of like thinking about how do you solve the problems? So when you see problems, don't see it as a fixed thing that can't be resolved. This field is moving very quickly. And there's a lot of optimists, and it's just not a zero-sum kind of mentality where things are built and you're kind of like fighting over a fixed pie. It's like things are wide open, and you have the opportunity to come in and contribute and really shape the way things are being built and make big contributions. So yeah, I would just encourage people to look more into things and figure out how they can contribute.
Yeah, I totally agree with all the points that Craig just made. And I agree. It's about the sustainability of your company. Like this stuff is coming, and businesses they just have to adapt all the time. And you're probably going to be outcompeted if you don't adapt in some way. And I think, one mistake that I see, kind of my old colleagues kind of reaching out to me, asking me about blockchain and how they can integrate it within their own companies. They kind of see it as like, oh, this is just like AI. Like we're just going to plug it and play it into our current systems and we're just going to make more money type of thing. But that's not the reality of the blockchain. Like you do need to kind of fully understand what it does, why it does it, and kind of transition to that model a little bit more. So yeah, I totally agree with the points Craig made there.
Hey, this is Stefan from the Graph Academy, announcing the Graph Academy Grants Program, a program that is intended to foster the growth of our community-driven platform, the Graph Academy. We are offering grants to contributors to incentivize the creation of high-quality educational material. If you want to apply, simply visit thegraph.academy/grants. That is thegraph.academy/grants. You can also find more information in the show notes.
Well, this idea that Web3 isn't an all or nothing or either or type of scenario, meaning that blockchain and Web3 can exist while some features or organizations in Web2 exist, has come up multiple times on the podcast. How would you help listeners better understand this type of dynamic where you have a Web3 and a Web2 coexisting together? For me, still learning these things, it doesn't seem like it's possible.
Well, one thing I would say is, to me, it really is about progressive decentralization, because if you do decentralize something too soon and kind of give all that power away to this automated, kind of web entity, there's a lot of risk that is associated with that, especially, as we're still trying to do a lot of work around things like decentralized identities. And there's a lot more ways in which you can attack these types of systems. So I think for the foreseeable future, there's definitely going to be for sure some kind of coexisting between the two for that reason. But long term, I mean, this is just kind of my personal opinion, but, I would expect Web3 to just be a more efficient, better way of a lot of current systems. So when people kind of act like, why do we have to blockchain this and blockchain that? Like there's very little that I could point to that that wouldn't benefit in some way from moving more in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, like some things like Cloudflare are just not going to go away. And SQL databases to scale to billions of people, you're going to need those things. So I guess what we're all calling Web 2, there's the business models, right? And then there's like the technologies. And so the technologies underneath, those are going to be needed. No question. And they can be implemented in a more decentralized way, which is what the graph is doing. We're using Postgres databases, a lot of like open source software and, these systems that can scale under the hood. But, we're enabling community ownership and participation by indexers who are running the infrastructure and getting the indexer and query rewards, and curators who also participate and delegators who also participate. So the underlying technologies that have been established to scale Web 2 systems, they're still going to be around for sure. And in that sense, probably the cloud providers still going to be, around, but maybe the business models will get disrupted, because I just think there are massive incentives and like a very strong value proposition for as a user to, be able to share in the upside of the platforms that you use. So like Ricky was saying earlier, instead of the benefits just going to a small group of shareholders, users, they have some ownership and some say in the protocol development or platform product development. And that's just, I think a very powerful value proposition right now.
Yeah. And one more thing I would also say is I feel like people have this notion that, Web3 and Web2 are so kind of fundamentally different from like, a person working within a company. But in reality, I think it's just about the structure of the company. It's, as an analyst, whatever your job is, your experience is going to be similar. Like when you're interacting with a Web3 protocol, like right now, we're all talking to each other. We're all in kind of traditional roles, even though we're working for a protocol. So it's not like there's, everything kind of functions as like an open source DAO for every little decision. Like you kind of delegate things to individuals, in similar ways that like you would in Web 2. You just do it kind of aligning the incentives differently.
Well, I appreciate both your ideas on this interesting dichotomy between Web 2 and Web 3. If we think about the Web 3 stack, about the things that must be in place for Web 3 to fully be actualized, what, Ricky, would be part of that Web 3 stack to have at least something or a framework or rails upon which Web 3 to fully be adopted?
One thing that I would say that comes to mind is, something like GitHub that is more kind of open source and decentralized. We do have Radical, but we always hear about a lot of problems with Radical. So that's one thing that comes to mind, because GitHub is obviously where everyone collaborates today, and it was bought out by Microsoft. So that's one piece. One other thing that really kind of jumps out to me is more related to like the work I do around like the metaverse and like this idea I have of creating a public open source university in the metaverse. I think a lot of the hardware side really needs to catch up. Like I think we are kind of at risk of like bigger companies like Facebook, Apple, really being able to get ahead and dominating things on the hardware side, which is really difficult for us to solve. But in terms of like software and protocols, I think, something for code management, like Radical probably is a big one, but I'm sure Craig has some other thoughts in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about something that's going to have to happen on a decade or multi-decade time scale, because, if you look at most of the coordination that's happening, it's happening on Discord, Twitter, so chat, things like that. We would need decentralized applications for that. I do think that's how things will trend, but I do think it's going to be on a longer time horizon, probably than people are thinking right now.
Craig, I want to come back to something we alluded to a little bit earlier, but now in the context of this non-binary situation between Web 2 having to lose for Web 3 to be fully adopted, that these things can coexist in some ways. And in addition to that, this timeline that it's going to take more time, more build for Web 3 to be fully evolved. What, in that context, what is then your long-term vision for the graph?
Yeah, I think long term, I would like to see the graph decentralize every part of the data science stack and empower anyone in the world to use blockchain data to develop applications. So right now, we're kind of focused on the OLTP use case with like live transaction data streams. But, in the near term, I think, we'll have some more support for OLAP type queries like aggregations. And I also want us to be able to support that decentralized Databricks or Snowflake use case where people are able to query on a, really large data sets and do joins across multiple subgraphs, on like terabytes of historical data. And, fit models on like user behavior to better understand how people are using things, and then also produce recommendations and, enable Web3 social media or search engine use cases where people can bring their own model to different environments. So like some people might want, a model like you hear a lot of controversy about like social media amplifying controversial takes and like, creating more antagonism in society, more conflict by amplifying those voices in order to, produce more engagement, which is beneficial to their business model. So maybe some people, that's not the type of content they want to see. So, people should be able to choose what type of data the model's trained on. So like, can you use my data or not? And B, what type of content do I want to see, or like what type of app environment do I want to be in? So maybe there's like a super civil social network where content that, is trying to bridge across political divides. That's the type of content that gets amplified. And so the discussions on that platform are going to be very different from the discussions somewhere else where, the most salacious stuff is getting amplified. And so giving users the ability to kind of like opt in to what type of data is being used to train the model, and also giving people more control. I think those are the types of use cases I would like to see the graph empower in the future.
How about you, Ricky? What's your long-term vision for the graph?
Yeah, I think Craig actually did a really great job kind of summarizing that previously and just right now. In fact, the example I was going to bring up is exactly the one he just brought up of the bring your own algorithm, to social media or, whatever website you're interacting with. That's actually the exact same example I had in mind. So I think, he's already done a great job covering that. And I think, the other one that we also kind of touched upon earlier is the public data use case and how we can kind of expand this framework to, all data, under these same kind of rules.
Craig and Ricky, thank you so much for your time. It's been very interesting to hear more about your roles in data and Web3 from your perspective. If listeners want to learn more about some of the work you're doing, what are some resources or some things that they can have access to better educate themselves?
Yeah, so our focus this year has been on powering internal decision-making. So we've been setting up internal systems for monitoring and metrics and dashboarding and so on to get the decentralized network quality service really strong and ready for self-service onboarding. But our focus in the new year is going to be on engaging the community and open sourcing more of our data to power external decision-making, not only of participants in the graph ecosystem, but also Web3 in general. So in setting up our internal systems, we've basically been dogfooding state-of-the-art tools and learning a lot about the trade-offs with an eye towards designing a full data science stack for processing on and off-chain data. And our data engineer, Aaron, has done an amazing job setting up our data warehouse environment and establishing the pipelines that power our analyses. He's going to have a blog post coming out soon to discuss the streaming architecture he set up for real-time data processing. And that's going to power a lot of the dashboards on the Graph Explorer and some other front-end contexts.
Yeah, definitely more to come on that front. I would definitely point people again, to the blog posts. I think there's been some really great posts. So the ones by Brandon around protocol economics and like the deeper dives that have been taken on the blog posts. I think those are really great resources for users. I also think, like community members like Graphtronauts have done a really great job. Again, he was also on the podcast, so recommend users to check that out for sure. And then kind of on a more personal note, I'll also be working on kind of this concept of a open source decentralized university in the metaverse, which will be, all powered by the graph, which will kind of take deeper dives into like real problems, real topics, and hopefully be kind of in the longer term, be a great resource.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRTiQ Podcast. Roger that.